do you have family stories that get told over and over every year? Like maybe cringy, maybe funny, maybe heartwarming, but stories that the family just kind of shares about the time that Jaron did X, Y, and Z, or so-and-so did this, or Uncle Joe did that. We have one in my family, and it's cute and cringy, and you'll hear a little bit of that in this story, but it's one that my mom loves to tell, and she's probably watching online, so Mom, you are welcome. Here is the story. It goes back to me at 2 years old. Little brown Fisher-Price record player, and my mom's favorite Christmas album, which was Nat King Cole. And the story goes, I don't remember it, I just can share it from being told over and over again. The story goes, the record was playing, the songs were going, and my mom looks over, and there's me, like sitting with my eyes wide and intent, listening to Nat King Cole sing the very best Christmas carol. And at the end of the song, I looked at my mom and I said, Mom, and I was a talker at 2, shocker. Mom, does this mean that I am the second Noel? Cute, slightly cringy, yes, you're welcome. But these are the stories that get told over and over again, and we have family stories, and even in our own lives, we have the stories that we probably tell and retell. The mountaintop moments, the good things that happen, the ones that we're happy and proud to tell and share with people. And then the ones that maybe we're not quite as forthright about, maybe the stories that are still tender, the hard ones, the ones that maybe aren't quite as shiny or pretty, but they're there. We hold on to them, the memories, the stories, the things that happen. But throughout history, there's one thing that remains true, and that is that God's people have always been and always will be storytelling people. What do I mean by that? Well, it goes all the way back to, obviously, in Scripture, the book that we use to live our lives from. But the Jewish people, dating all the way back to the very beginning, were storytelling people. And what I mean by this is if you look at the Jewish calendar today, every holiday, holy day, festival that they celebrate comes back to a story. It might be a story of tragedy or triumph, but they are literally commanded to tell and retell stories, and this is how their entire calendar exists. So you think about the story of Passover. Probably many of you know this story. The people of Israel were enslaved for 400 years in Egypt, and then Moses comes and he brings the 10 plagues. You know, God sends him to be a deliverer to the people of Israel, and he has 1 plague, 2 plague. The plagues keep coming, and the story keeps going, and things are getting darker and harder and heavier, and the people are being oppressed. And then after the 10th plague, the plague where the firstborn children were killed, God creates a way for his people to be redeemed and to be saved, and those children to be passed over so they didn't die. So you have this holiday that we know as Passover, right? And what I want to share with you is not only is it just a great story that they remember, but is actually a commandment in Scripture for them to remember. And in Exodus chapter 13, I want you to hear this because this is like the crux of how we're to live our lives. Moses said to the people, "This is a day to remember forever, the day that you left Egypt, the place of your slavery. Today the Lord has brought you out by the power of his mighty hand. Remember, eat no food containing yeast," because they had to flee Egypt as fast as they could, so they didn't have time for the bread to rise. So when Passover comes, they don't eat food with yeast. "And on this day, in early spring, in the month of Abib, you have been set free. You must celebrate this event in this month each year after the Lord brings you into the land of the promised land." And verse 8, it says, "On the 7th day, you must explain to your children, I am celebrating what the Lord did me when I left Egypt. This annual festival will be a visible sign to you, like a mark branded on your hand or your forehead. Let it remind you always to recite the teaching of the Lord. With a strong hand, the Lord rescued you from Egypt. So observe this decree of this festival at the appointed time every year. And in the future, your children will ask you, what does all this mean? Then you will tell them, with the power of his mighty hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, the place of slavery. So we have this story that is not just a nice story to repeat, but it's actually one that they're commanded to tell every single year. Not a story that's happy and shiny and pretty, but a story of joy. And then they've also been commanded for a festival that they call the Feast of Booths. It happens in the fall every year. It's called Sukkot. And this is where the people of Israel remember that they were in the wilderness for 40 years. And so what they're commanded to do is to build a shelter in their backyard wherever they are. Instead of sleeping in their house, they create a tent and they sleep outside to remember there was a time and a season when they had no permanent shelter, when they were wandering and they didn't know where their next meal would come from. And in that season, God showed up and provided protection, sustenance, provision. And so in Leviticus 23, they're commanded to observe this festival to the Lord for 7 days every year. This is a permanent law, not temporary. It doesn't end in 2014. A permanent law for you, and it must be observed in the appointed month from generation to generation. This story has to keep being told. For 7 days, live outside in little shelters. All native-born Israelites must live in shelters. This will remind each new generation of Israelites that I made their ancestors live in shelters when I rescued them from the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So you have these stories that are told and retold. And you think about the rest of the things in the Jewish calendar. There's Purim, there's Hanukkah. All of these things are stories that are told and retold to remember the faithfulness of God. God's people have always been a storytelling people. And when you think about Christmas time, most of us think happy, shiny, pretty, bows and presents, snow. Probably wasn't snow the first Christmas. I'm just letting you guys know, in the middle of the desert. I doubt there was snow. But we often think that following Jesus, Christmas time, all of these things are these happy, shiny, pretty, perfect moments. And the reality is that first Advent was anything but shiny or pretty. It was pretty gritty. It was disruptive. It was uncertain. And I don't know if you have ever found yourself in a situation like that, but I think we all have at times, where we didn't really know what was going to happen in our relationship. It felt like it was broken beyond repair, or we didn't know where the finances were going to come from, or we didn't know how things were going to shake out in the world, and there was a sense of uncertainty. And that's actually what the season of Advent is all about. And we're in week 4 of Advent, but if you didn't know, the Christian calendar is something that's existed for years and years and years and generations, and it actually has a similar rhythm. Every part of the Christian calendar is attached to a story that we're supposed to tell and retell and remember. And Advent is the very beginning of the Christian calendar. This is the first part of the annual calendar of the Christian faith, and it begins with this moment of Jesus showing up in the middle of disruptive and hard moments. And that's the beginning of Advent. And I think sometimes we think Christmas is supposed to be about joy, but the problem comes when we think that joy and happiness are the exact same thing. And they're not. Happiness is fragile. Sometimes it's circumstantial. It can come, it can go. I can feel happy. I can at this one good thing, and 5 minutes later, I can be really irritated at something else. It fluctuates, but joy is a constant, and it's actually called to be the marker of God's people. Storytelling people, and not just any story, stories of joy. And we're called to tell stories of joy. And I think sometimes we have stories that are happening and going on in our lives even now. Some of us are in the middle of chapters that maybe feel uncertain. Situations that don't feel tied up in a pretty bow. Pain that still feels pretty fresh. Just me, or is there anyone else? Yeah, we've all been there. And so the very first Advent story is a story where right in the middle of a hard, challenging, stretching, stressful comes joy. When you look back at these stories that the Israelites experienced over time, they are hard, but yet somehow they also are stories of joy. And this is the nature of God, is that we can have both the beautiful and the hard coexist together. Stories that are hard, and you think about the ones you've walked through, the ones that have been the most painful, can also be the stories where joy is found so deeply, and the type of joy that can't just go away in a fleeting moment, but it's eternal. So here we are. We're going to look in Luke chapter 2 at the first Christmas story, and we're going to read through it. But I want you to imagine, we are looking at the Christmas story when we think about the birth of Jesus and all the characters that we've been talking about for the last few weeks, Mary, Joseph, the shepherds, and we feel like 2,000 years later, when we look back, it's like, what an honor. Like, you were asked to be the mother of the Messiah. What an honor. You got the first news of Jesus' birth. And we think, if you're like me and maybe as old as me, you remember Ed McMahon, and he'd show up on your doorstep with a giant check and be like, you just won Publishers Clearinghouse. If you're not as old as me, a check is something that people used to transfer money with. It would be similar to me just showing up on your door and being like, you won the lottery. The Powerball is yours. And you'd be like, that's what we think, oh wow, you're gonna be, the mother of the Son of God. What? Probably didn't feel like that. Because with the arrival of that angel on their doorstep, instead of a check, it was you're gonna be right in the middle of scandal. People are probably not gonna understand you. You might get canceled. You're gonna stay married to this woman. She was obviously unfaithful to you. How'd you get pregnant? All of these questions and whispers. And so they're invited into this story, not only just their own story, but you look at the greater story in that moment, the story of the political unrest, the oppression that was happening to the Jewish people at that time, with Roman Empire just ruling, with weight and heaviness and tension and taxes. Expensive, uncertain. And then all of a sudden this census is called. And I don't know if you've ever been 9 months pregnant, but I have a few times. And probably the worst thing you could tell me is I had to go by donkey days on end without knowing where I was going to sleep and just be yeah, I'm showing up for a census. But this is where Mary was at. It was disruptive, inconvenienced, stressful. I get stressed just going on a road trip, knowing exactly where I'm going to sleep that night, where am I going to plug in my car? These are the questions that are going through my mind. I can imagine the uncertainty for them. But in Luke chapter 2, verse 6, we have this picture of them. They're there in Bethlehem for the census, and the time came for the baby to be born. She gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no lodging available for them. No Airbnb, no hotel, not a rooftop tent, nothing. That night, there were shepherds staying in the fields nearby, guarding their flocks of sheep. Suddenly, the angel of the Lord appeared among them, and the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. They were terrified, but the angel reassured them, "Don't be afraid. I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all people. The Savior, yes, the Messiah, has been born today in Bethlehem, the city of David, and you'll recognize him by this sign. You'll find the baby wrapped snugly in strips of cloth, lying in a manger." Suddenly the angel was joined by a vast host of others, the armies of heaven, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and peace on earth to those whom God is pleased." In the middle of this scary, disruptive, confusing, uncertain time comes people saying, hey, this is a joyful thing, actually. What's happening here, don't be afraid. It's going to be good. It's a good moment. Because right in that moment, Matthew 1:23 was being realized in that moment. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She'll give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel. Can everyone say Emmanuel? Which means God is with us. And it's at this moment in the story where Emmanuel, this promised Messiah, shows up on the scene for the first time in history. And at this moment, everything changes. This is the Advent. This is what we've been waiting for, the opportunity that a far off, distant God has come close. He's near. And in the middle of a stressful, disruptive, uncomfortable story, God is present. And that one Christmas carol says, "The weary world rejoices." That phrase comes to me because have you ever been weary? Like, something good has to come. Like, I don't know how much longer I can do this. I've been waiting for you to come through. This feels too hard. I don't know how much longer I can go on. And in that moment, history felt that weariness when Emmanuel, God with us, showed up on the scene. And suddenly what was disruptive and hard and heavy has the capacity to also have joy. In John 1:14, the Message version says it so beautifully. The Word, which was Jesus, became flesh, took on human flesh and blood, and moved into the neighborhood. I love that. The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Savior of the world, took on human flesh and moved into the neighborhood, right next door to us, right in the midst of us, right where our pain is. Not in the shiny platformy moments, but in the places where we need him most. The everyday life. He came and showed up to meet us exactly where we are in the middle of our own story. And in the science of joy, and there's been a lot of science done on joy. If you want to Google or go down some ChatGPT rabbit holes, start to understand and study the power and the science of joy. Because what scientists are finding out is that our brains are hardwired to run on joy. The neurotransmitters of dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, these are chemicals that run through our body, and our brains are looking for them, constantly trying to find them. And oftentimes we're looking at things and trying to find them in things that are temporal and won't satisfy. But joy is found, and this is what I want you to hear today. The reason we can have joy in the middle of hard circumstances, of heavy circumstances, of uncertain circumstances, is because joy is about connection. It's not the absence of hard things, but it's the presence of God in the middle of them. It's Emmanuel, God with us. It's joy with us. So wherever you are today, because Jesus came, because of those first moments where he was announced that joy is here, it's because he's here, and we can have connection with him in the middle of any of it and all of it. And so our brains are hardwired to seek joy. And also joy is the one emotion that can coexist with all other emotions. Think about it. Some of the most devastating times, we can be losing a loved one in the most extreme circumstances and not know how we're going to get through it. And then alongside comes someone to sit with you, to bring you a meal. Or you look at a sunset and you see beauty and joy, and you're reminded that even in the middle of this, joy is possible. Joy can coexist with fear. Joy can coexist with loneliness. When we're longing for heaven and the people that are far away, we can experience connection because Emmanuel, God with us. He's here, he's present. I love how the author of Hebrews talks about when Jesus went to the cross. And in verse 2 of chapter 12, it says that we can fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. In the middle of the most excruciating, sacrificial, painful moment of history, Jesus had joy. And joy was set in front of him. And do you know what that joy was? It was connection. He knew that this mission was to create not only connection for him to the Father, but him to us, and us to the Father, and reconcile God to man. We have the ability to have joy in the hardest of circumstances because of our connection and and the presence of God in our lives. And so when the story of Advent comes, it gives us hope that here and now, in the moment that you're living, in the story that you're walking out, and we're all walking out stories right now. We're all in the middle of stories. We're storytelling people. And you might be in a chapter that feels great. You love it. It's your favorite chapter. Don't let it end. And you might be in the middle of a chapter that you're like, wow, I did not sign up for this chapter. I did not see this coming. I didn't know it would be this hard. And in the middle of that chapter, that story can still be a story of joy because God is present with us in it. In the book of Job, most of us are probably familiar with Job. He had a tough situation, a lot of hardship. He walked through loss of literally everything. A story that none of us, he's so famous for his story being hard. Like, you talk about the patience of Job, right? He's known for it. His story was hard. And at the end of his story, in Job 42, he says this phrase that I love so much. He said, I had only heard about you before, but now I've seen you with my own eyes. Think about that for a second. He had heard about the power of God. He had heard about the presence of God, but through the darkest and heaviest and hardest chapter of his life, he now says, I had heard about you, but now I know you. And I think about the ways and the places that God's shown up in my own life. The heaviest and hardest moments. And I can say he navigated those with me. He walked through those with me. And I can say confidently, I'd heard about you before, but now I've seen you. And that's a story worth telling and retelling. And it's the story of joy that as we celebrate Advent, we recall the stories that have happened in the past and maybe the ones we're living in right now that are designed to be stories of joy. Even now, even in this moment, he's present. So I want you to think about the stories of your life right now, where you're at. And maybe we're going to take like 10 seconds. I want you to think about what chapter are you in right now? And where is God in it? Is he showing up with peace? Is he offering you hope? Is he providing wisdom to you? Is there provision? Where is God at work in your story right now? We're not always trained to see this. Sometimes our eyes go straight to what's missing, what's not right, what should be that, who should be here, who should be acting like this, who should be doing this, and we sometimes lose sight of where God is showing up. And it's often in places we didn't expect, like maybe a stable and a manger in the middle of smelly animals in places that you didn't quite seem. This is where you're at, God. This is where you're working. In the middle of your pain, sickness, disappointment, where is God showing up right now? And if we're going to be people who tell stories of joy, we have to get really good at seeing where God is working and calling it out and telling others the story of God's faithfulness in our lives. And those stories we can tell and retell, and as we do, we become people of joy because we see where God is at work, weaving things together in situations. I have a friend walking through a situation right now, and she's like, every single time this barrier obstacle comes up, I'm like, I just know I'm just waiting to see, how's he gonna turn this around? And he does. And he will. And he is. But if we don't train our eyes, then we don't see it. So we have to begin to see our stories with the eyes of joy. The eyes that Emmanuel, God is with us. He's present, he's here, he put on flesh and blood, and he moved into the neighborhood, and he's right there in the middle of our story, and our eyes have to be trained to see it, and our mouths have to be trained to tell it and share it. One of the other ways that God shows up is through people. We show up through connection with him, but connection with him often looks like the faces and the people that he's placed into your life right now. Maybe the people sitting next to you. Maybe the people you think this person should show up for you, but instead God's shown up for you in the face of this person or that person. 2 Corinthians 6:10 says, our hearts ache, but we always have joy. Again, joy can coexist. Our hearts ache, but we always have joy. Like, this is the early church talking about the challenges of bringing a new faith into existence, taking the gospel of Jesus to the world. Our hearts ache, but we always have joy. We are poor, but we give spiritual riches to others. We own nothing, yet we have everything. This is how we have to train our eyes, not in the outcomes of pretty perfect bows, but in the ability to see where God is at work in the faces of the people that he's placed in our lives. Who has he placed in your life? Where is he showing up? All throughout the New Testament, the church, they understood that God showed up in the faces of people. In Ephesians, we share in each other's in Galatians, like every single, share in each other's burdens, be happy with those who are happy, weep with those who weep, encourage each other and build each other up. These are all commandments that the early church had to show up and be conduits of God's joy in each other's lives. And so not only do we see, we can have a story of joy because God is present, but God is present through the people that he's placed in our lives. And that is confusing and that is hard, because if we sat around here and I gave every single one of you a microphone, should we do it? Everyone's like, no. And you shared the story of pain and heartache and loss and challenge in your life, I guarantee you it's probably going to come down to another person that hurt you or a choice that was made. Because a lot of our pain comes from people. And so it's really easy to put up walls and to isolate ourselves and to just like say it's not worth it because people are disappointing sometimes. And yet, as the people of God who are a storytelling people, we're called to show up and be people of joy to each other on our darkest days, in our hardest moments. How do we put on flesh and blood, roll up our sleeves, and move into the neighborhood? How do we show up for the people in our lives? Because joy comes with both connection to God and community and connection with others. And I say it, and I probably will, that will be part of any time you ever hear me talk, because I believe it, and it's a commandment for us to follow Jesus together in community. And it's not pretty, and it's not like idyllic and like everything's always happy and wonderful. Sometimes it's hard. A lot of times it's messy. Sometimes people are annoying. I agree. But even still, it's the way that God shows up on this earth is through people. So it's connection to God and people, and that connection is what can make any single story that we're walking in and living in right now a story of joy. Has anyone ever read the book Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl? A few of you? It's like, you should all download it today, so go get it. Story of a man who walked through the concentration camps in World War II and wrote the most powerful, his takeaway was, you can walk through anything, but what he understood is that we are storytelling people. We're constantly having a narrative internally. And if we don't find meaning and significance, when we do, I should say, we can walk through anything. How does this story become a story of joy? Am I going to be a victim in this story? Or am I going to be a victor? Is life happening to me? Or is this an opportunity for God to move and show up in my life and for me to show up in the life of someone else? And so as we become people who tell stories, the challenge for us, for you, for me, in these next couple weeks and on into next year and in your life is these two things. What story am I telling right now? Because I'm going to be telling a story. And I can tell a story and repeat a story over and over and over, and it can be the soundtrack to my life. and it probably will be. And so the challenge is, am I going to see the joy in the middle of my story? Where is God showing up? Am I telling a story of joy, even if it's hard, even when it's hard? And where am I being invited to step into someone else's story? Where am I being invited? Is it a neighbor? Is it a friend? Is it calling someone that you really have dreaded that phone call, but you know it's the right thing to do? Is it showing up on their doorstep? Is it bringing them something that they need? How are we invited to be a conduit of joy in someone else's story? And with that, we will be, as God intended, a storytelling people. I think back to one of the most memorable moments of my life. It was a story, and I tell this story a lot because it is a story of joy. It didn't start out that way, though. I was 5 years old. It was Christmas. And I grew up, there was a lot of financial challenges where I grew up and the story of my life in my early years. And this was an exceptionally hard year. I remember we didn't have a Christmas tree, I know that. And my dad was working really hard to provide for the family. My mom was pregnant. She had one little brother and another on the way. And I remember it being really hard. It wasn't cheerful or joyful. And then my grandfather, who lived in Oregon, had a heart attack. And it was a really scary moment for our family. He was like the patriarch of the family. Everyone loved Poppy. I loved Poppy more than anything. And I remember we scrounged up any dollars that we had to fly my mom and my brother and I to Oregon because we wanted to be close, because at that time we didn't know what was going to happen or how it was going to turn out. And my dad couldn't come. And I remember as a 5-year-old, like looking back, it's, hindsight is 2020, but as 5 years old, this was like the worst thing in the world to not be with your dad on Christmas. And what's going to happen with Poppy and all these things. I just felt heaviness. I remember that, and it's clear, and I felt it, and I remember we were all there, and it was just like whispers of adults, and as a kid, I'm just like, what's going on? It didn't feel safe. It didn't feel happy. It didn't feel fuzzy. And we weathered the storm. He was going to be stabilized. He had several operations. And I remember about a week after Christmas, we got back to California, to my home. And one caveat you should know is that my dad didn't know Jesus. He wasn't a follower of Jesus. He had a pretty tough heart and really skeptical of a lot of people. And I'll never forget what happened. We walk into the house, and I'm a kid. Everything is from this big perspective. And I see a Christmas tree, and I knew there hadn't been a Christmas tree when I left, and it was dried, and the needles were dry. In Southern California, Christmas trees do not last a long time. But the thing I'll never forget is that Christmas tree was covered in cash. Dollars, from the top, and I'm like, we are rich. What just happened? And we were gone. I knew we had no money, and we came back, and our tree is covered in cash. How did this happen? It's a Christmas miracle. My eyes were big, and I thought of all the things I could buy with that money. And it turns out that while we were gone, my mom's little church brought a Christmas tree in and covered that tree in cash. And I thought about that story, which was a heavy and a hard and just as a kid, what a turnaround it was. And to me, what a beautiful picture of what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to live. To be not only people who receive God's joy in the middle of every single situation in our lives, even when it's hard, and to tell that story, but also to be people who bring that joy to other people with whatever we have. I'm sure it wasn't millions of dollars, but to me at 5, it felt like it. And to my parents who every dollar, when $20 might as well be $5 million, you've been there. It meant so much. And so I think about this perspective that we can take on. And we are God's people, and we're called to be people who tell stories of joy and perpetuate stories of joy. So with that, there's no better way to kind of culminate that than with the ultimate story of joy. And so if you can take out your communion elements, If you didn't get them, they're in the back. We're going to take communion together. And what a perfect picture of how every story is a joy-filled story. The heaviest, the darkest, when all seemed lost, in the middle of our brokenness, Jesus stepped in and said, not only am I coming to show up in the middle of your story, but I'm going to make a way for you, for your story to be different. And that's why we tell this story every week. Every single time we come together, we tell this story. It's not just something to do because it makes God happy, but it's a story that we remember what he's done. We are storytelling people, and this is the greatest story ever told, and this is our opportunity to remember it. So we're going to take the bread, and with it, remember the brokenness of Jesus. Remember that every bone in his body was broken. There's no pain or temptation he didn't feel. He felt it all for us. Would you take the bread with me? And then the cup of his blood. Not really his blood, it's grape juice, as you know. But it's the remembrance that there isn't anything you or I can do that his blood didn't cleanse. There's no separation between us and him. He's with us, he's present. Our failures and our triumphs, none of it could earn us the right to be in a relationship with God, but the sacrifice of Jesus. And so we tell this story because he's worthy. And he shows up in the middle of our story. And he redeems every story. Let's drink. Would you stand? And we're going to sing and worship. And as we do, my prayer, I'm going to pray before we do, is that you would begin to have eyes to see your story in a different way. That your heart would be stirred. And as you look at the people around you in this room, outside this room, in your family, in your neighborhood, that we would be reminded that we're invited to be not only storytellers of joy, but conduits of joy in people's story. So God, I thank you for every person in this space. God, I ask you to open our eyes to see where you're at work. Remind us of the hope and the joy that you want to bring into every chapter of our story, God. You never leave us. You never forsake us, God. We love you, and I thank you for your joy and your peace today, in Jesus' name.